For anyone watching the video, this is the last of our seminar series. We're gonna bring together a lot of topics that we've been talking about, focusing on strategies to reduce gun violence. We've talked about some policing issues, both in terms of what's effective in lowering gun violence, but also issues relevant to police legitimacy in their communities. In my first talk, I touched upon a range of strategies to reduce gun violence, including street outreach and violence interruption, conflict mediation with the highest risk groups of individuals. And while I feel like I'm an expert on the research on that topic, today you actually get an expert in actually doing that kind of work. Tenny Gross is probably one of the most experienced, credible, thoughtful people who has been doing this type of work for decades now, starting in Boston 20 years ago or so, 25 years ago, and was part of really a beautiful thing that came together to reduce very high rates of gun violence, particularly affecting youth in Boston, and was part of an overall strategy with criminologist David Kennedy, who was focusing more on focused approach to law enforcement, but key to doing that kind of work and having that kind of sustained change was the kind of street outreach work that Tenny was very much a part of and led. And he has built on that work over the last 25 years to really refine this as an art, I think, and has gone not only to major cities around the United States, but other countries as well, have had experience working on the same issues of conflict and violence through his institute, but working in Israel and Ireland, Belfast, a lot of different places. So I'm just so pleased and honored that Tenny could join us today, and I want you to welcome him, Tenny Gross. Thank you. So if you could just flip this on.
Great. Thank you for burning your lunch hour here with me. And it's great to be here and to speak about a topic that I love. And I think the topic that is really, really important. So you can hear from my accent that I'm not from Baltimore, not even from Providence, Rhode Island. I'm an Israeli. I served in the Israeli army. My mother was a Christian Serb. My dad was a Croatian Jew, so my DNA brought to you some of the most choice wars on the planet, I'm afraid. So the fact that I'm doing now nonviolence is a little token of, not forgiveness, but actually redemption, maybe. But I've seen the limit of force. Growing up in Israel, I really thought we have the right to defend ourselves. But the problem is when you unleash force, you can unleash it, you can control the unleashing of force. You cannot control the reactions, the back and forth. And another problem with violence is it weakens your faculty, actually, to use your words and to make peace. So we have in the Talmud, in our, what used to be our oral tradition, in Judaism, a few thousand-year-old sentence that says, life and death is in the hand of your tongue, right? And outreach workers, which is the field that I admire so much, and I'm part of it, we rely on our mouth. We're in a situation where people have guns, where people might be high, where people are stressed, and we do not have the equipment you would expect someone to have, which is a gun and a bulletproof vest. We only have awareness, subtlety, and we have a very powerful weapon. It's called love. Very powerful weapon. You gotta love human beings to do this work, right? And so after my military service, I left to London for 2 years. worked a bit with homeless population. I enjoyed some culture. And then my sister was a former commander in the Israeli Air Force. Her husband worked at Children's Hospital. She said, why don't you come and study in college here? I had no intentions of coming to the United States, but I ended up in Boston. And I was really going to be an Athenian. After you grow up in Sparta and in war, I said, this is it. I'm going to read books. My parents never finished high school because of World War II. So I studied the Greeks, I studied political philosophy, I studied arts. But pretty quickly when I came to the United States, a case broke out. It was the Charles Stewart case in Boston. A man called 911 and said, a black man just shot my pregnant wife outside of a Harvard hospital. And that changed the trajectory of my life, I guess. I got involved with a Pentecostal church in Dorchester, and I had no context. People who usually work in this field have a context. They grew up in the environment. They know why it happened. I would show up in Dorchester in 0 to 1 to 4, the most violent zip code at the time. Had no idea that we were about to approach the peak of the crack epidemic, 152 homicides. And I literally would get off the bus with a Nikon camera at 11 at night, and drug dealer said, hey, MF, you better be trying to sell it. And I said, as an Israeli, I said, no, I'm not selling the camera. But that was my involvement at the time. I was really clueless. And we would hang with the first gang in Boston, Corbett Street. And my teachers were upset. I wasn't photographing. And I said, this is so foreign to me. I'm just listening. And that's another skill. If you know anything about our culture, we're not great listeners often. We like to talk. And to train yourself actually to listen. And I didn't understand 60% of what they were saying on top of it. Not only was I struggling with English, I really didn't know any of the inner city and gang slang. So I was really struggling. I was reading at home. People were giving me what to read. I was trying to follow up, and I spent a lot of time in the neighborhood. Eventually, I started teaching photography for young people who were coming from court and from jails. And they said, Tenny, represent me in court. Show up, tell the judge I'm doing something positive. And slowly, slowly, you can see. And very early on, we befriended a drug dealer who was my age. Had an AK-47. He was the ruler of that neighborhood. And he really thought he was a teacher to the churches why they failed and drug dealers won. He said, you're not here in the morning. We are. You're not here in the afternoon. You're not here in the evening. When Johnny goes to the little bodega on the corner, I give him an extra $1. I'm buying loyalty. You are not. You're here on Sunday. I win, you lose. If you want to change that, you got to be here. So part of really, people call us experts, and it's really on one of our, places like Ashoka and Skoll called me and told me, we want to give you an innovation award. And I was like, I'm not interested in an innovation award. I'm actually an archaeologist. I'm puzzled how this advanced society forgot to raise its children. I'm not trying to discover something new. I'm actually trying to find out where is it that we forgot how every other society was raising its children safely. That was every business of every society, and why are we failing so badly? So I don't see ourselves as innovators. We actually try and look into what has been done. What is common sense? Sometimes when we try and innovate, we try and look for very smart solutions. It's a temptation, sometimes takes us away from looking at common sense. So what I think works in our field, what works in our field is to love people, which is not my initial inclination. I did not grow up in a church, right? I grew up in a country that relied on an army, but I've seen the limitations of it. And as an outreach worker in Boston, as a street worker, I discovered really the power of caring for people. And then a lot of people care for me, and a lot of people mentor me. So that's another thing. This is not charity. I sit with gang members in my office. What I'm doing for you is not charity. It's been done for me, and I want a safer world for my children. So it's a reciprocal thing. And the other thing is really relationship. And young people that we work with don't want us to pretend that we're them. All right, I had a very good friend, a mentor, was an outreach worker in Boston. We worked with the Intervale gang, at the time one of the most difficult gangs in Boston. And he said, Tenny, they saw me drinking with a friend of mine in the bar near the neighborhood, and they were all upset. I said, isn't that ridiculous, the people who shoot people and drink in there? He says, how come they were upset at me? And I said to him, Jen, they're upset at you because they're looking at us as a hope that they're connected to someone who's going to live a legit life, and one day they're going to be able to live that. And you just sort of crush that hope for them, right? Because we all, I think, have this dual moral debate in our heads on choices all the time. And my experience with young people who are involved in violence is they expect from us to affirm one side of their debate, whereas maybe their crew sometimes will affirm the other side. Again, I'm generalizing, it's not completely fair, but that's what they expect of us, that dialogue. Then, if I look at the last 25 years of work, and I look at some of our goals, etc., there's really 3 big goals, I think. And it's something that came to me on. I'm a really slow learner, and this is not a false modesty. This really is true. I suck a lot of information, but things come to me very slowly. It's kind of an Eastern European thing, right? So the first goal is to reduce violence. Absolutely. The second one is I've been working with partners. I just came back from Chicago, from Cure Violence the last 2 days. I've been helping them on Thursday and Friday, some issues they have in Chicago. I've been involved with the Advancements Project in LA, a lot of places around the world, thinking about this field. And our goal is, and we need not to be selfish about it, so the Institute, you won't see our name anywhere outside of Providence, because I'm not trying to create an empire. We're trying to support our partners in the field. We have the largest population of people in jail on the planet. And that should be a challenge to all of us if you love democracy and freedom. Some of us who immigrate here love democracy and freedom even more, even I've been called all kinds of names by my NRA friends and others, but we love it, we come here. But when we lock up more people than others, more than China and Russia, for example, that should be a challenge, a fundamental challenge to us. But in what we do, to me, it's a workforce, right? A very small group of people who've been to jail, very small group, have the talent to become extraordinary peacemakers, right? I might have done this for 25 years, but I never will pretend that I'm an insider. All right? I have the privilege of working with people who grew up in the neighborhood, who experienced violence, and are, to me, amazing poets of peace and wisdom. So to me, there's no more thrilling thing than to be around a street worker who is really good, or an outreach worker, or an interrupter, whatever you want to call them. There's something amazingly powerful about a high intelligence with practical street knowledge. It is almost unmatched. I was last weekend giving a talk at the Mass Medical Society to doctors from around the country, and I hold doctors at high esteem. They do not have, though, as much common sense as a really smart street worker. Okay, and they're smart people. So the second thing, so one is reduce violence. The second goal I think that I've dedicated my life to is with partners around the country to create a career, a field that is legitimate, that has opportunity for education, seeding in those neighborhoods, people who know this life, but as examples of redemption, example of peacemaking. They know the knowledge like a businessman knows their terrain. They know their field. If the business is reducing violence, they understand the business of violence. And the third goal, which is relevant, is to help police, welcome, perfect timing, on cue, become a more legitimate part of American society. What is the police? The police is funded by us, the taxpayers. They work for us. In England, the police sees themselves as public servants. In America, and again, I'll generalize. I have very little time, so a lot of today's statements are generalization. You can pick them apart and we can go deeper, but won't happen today, right? So it's just teasers. But American policing, basically for white middle-class people, you see a cop, you're like, safety is here. If you're an inner-city African-American, it's like, harassment is here. I better be careful. These are two very different experiences of a government good, right? So the third goal of people like myself, David Kennedy, other people around the country, we've been working with progressive police chiefs. So it's Ed Davis, was Bratton, Charlie Beck, McCarthy now, and other people around the country to try and bring policing back into the fold, help it become more legitimate again within particularly in minority communities. And so some of you will say, well, look how badly we're doing now. Well, I think that wound has been covered in plasters for a long time. And actually now it's coming out with Ferguson, Staten Island, and we're talking about it. So as much as it looks ugly and tough, this is actually what a surgeon does when they expose the wound. It stinks, it's exposed, but you can't clean a wound without opening it. And that's where we are now. We're now acknowledging as society what police officers and minority communities knew and talked about forever, just the rest of us did not. And that is really, there was a deep mistrust and a feeling that certain lives are worth less than others, right? That if you're an African-American parent, you have to have a conversation with your child that is different than a white parent. So those things are coming out now, but those are the things, the three unifying goals, and the strategies that were built around the Boston ceasefire, the strategies we further develop in Providence. The head of our street worker program is today John Jay. I'm going to join him this evening. We're working with David Kennedy and John Jay, and we're continuing to refine how will reentry look better, how do we reduce violence, and how does the police become a legitimate force, more legitimate force, in addressing those issues. These are difficult issues. Some of those issues might take generation. The history of race in this society, I don't need to tell any one of you, is a very long and difficult one. Is there room for optimism? Well, the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence, hello, Chief, is based on Kingian nonviolence. And, you know, Martin Luther King said, the arc of the universe is long and it bends toward justice. And we believe it. We believe it. Even though there's a lot of setback, even though there's a lot of ugliness and sometimes room to be cynical, we actually do believe that. And you cannot afford not to work on it. So people say, well, who is the Martin Luther King today? Well, there isn't one. But Martin Luther King caught a wave of hundreds and thousands of churches and community people were working and working around Jim Crow, working before, and he was just a phenomenal spokesperson. It wasn't the only one. I actually fell in love with the movement through SNCC, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. That's the movement that inspired me. I know some of them. And there's a new book actually, that challenges nonviolence, one by Charles Cobb. It's called This Nonviolence Stuff is Going to Get You Killed. It's literally fresh off the shelves and actually argues there's been a lot of people with guns around the civil rights movement protecting them because the South was very, very violent. So these people had huge amount of courage, but they're also backed up by guns. So it's a bit more problematic. It wasn't just like everyone was nonviolent, it was all dreamy, etc. But I'm diverting. So I know that some of the things, questions people have, all right, so you run, the Institute runs 5 programs. We teach nonviolence. We teach Kingian nonviolence. We teach it in the police academy. We teach it in maximum security. We teach it in elementary schools, in community groups, right? It's trying to look and revive an idea that conflict is normal, but how we deal with conflict is different. How do you recognize when your temperature is rising up within you? So there's a major drug dealer in one of our neighborhoods, Lockwood, who I really wanted him to be an outreach worker. He says, Tenny, I'm not ready. I'm actually going to mess up your reputation. But he says to me, this is on a corner, he says to me, what I took away from the nonviolence training is to recognize the types and levels of conflict so I can escalate it down, whether it's with my girl or whether it's on the street. So we need to teach it. We teach violence in our society, and we forget that. We think we're born with that. We're not. We're taught. I was taught at 14 Krav Maga in Israel, which is now taught to your elite unit. At 14, I was capable of killing a person with my hands. It was a training. I didn't know how to do that. It was a South African Jew who was tired growing up in South Africa of being beaten, and he developed it. He happened to have a little office in the basement of a bus station where I was trained. Suddenly one day, 20 years later, I see it on C-SPAN training your elite units. But it started in a little basement space, gym, in my town. So we are taught to kill. Why wouldn't we taught also the faculties of peacemaking? So that's nonviolence. We have street workers. That's something I brought from Boston, right? I am a big believer in deploying and using people who were involved in violence, not all of them, but some, into peacemaking, into helping them. It's a program for them as well. 7 of our staff now are taking college classes. We already had 2 that graduated. They become, while they're working for us, ex-offenders, they're still shackled, in my opinion. Right? We will offer them a job. We have 4 people who committed homicides on our staff. Guess what? One of them was just rejected. He's a great construction guy. Was offered a job in a company, in a nonprofit, big nonprofit that has a lot of building facilities, and then with no explanation, even though he had a starting day, he couldn't get it. He said, Tenny, I'm 45 with a family. How long is this stigma going to carry on after he's been a peacemaker? So we got to think about opportunities to come back. I'm a big believer that desperate people are dangerous people. Common sense, right? But it still needs to be said. I've seen it with the Irish in Belfast. I've seen it with the Palestinians, right? This is not a good recipe to make peace if you're pushing people to the corner and hoping they'll do well. And so I'm a huge believer that not only are there assets, there's a lot of amazing people, but create real paths and real career for them. And we're discovering more and more things that I underestimated, is that they burn out. We're now doubling on our counseling for our staff. We need to find them out a path. So we have street workers who now run training department. They work with victim services. They moved on to other jobs, right? You cannot, most people age out of gangs. It's a tiny group of people which say, you aged out, now we're sending you right back in. That is very, very difficult. That is a very cruel demand. I'll tell you, we have one of our founders of our biggest Asian gang. We're the 3rd biggest Cambodian city in the United States, who was involved in a homicide, that knew a lot about gangs, obviously. Started a gang, right? Big gang. But 6 months after he started working for us, which was 8 years ago, he says, my God, I didn't realize there's so many conflicts in our city. Because gangs actually are aware of their own conflicts. They work on their own conflict by and large. They do not monitor. And what we are, in a way, we're a mirror to a police. We have our own capability of gathering data. We have our own capability of thinking about it, responding to it, which is good. Which is good to have that ability, that you have another set of eyes, another set of thinking, working on conflicts. And I will talk a little bit about police and outreach, because I know that's always a contention issue all around the country. I'll jump on that a little bit. So I was asked in other cities, Tenny, what does success look like? We cannot, outreach organizations, someone said to me, we cannot work with the police. What does success, you're always saying you got to have some sort of a working relationship with law enforcement. What does it look like? And I say Providence is a great success. What does great success look like after 14 years? A third of the police like us. They bought into the model. They've seen that we can stop some things when the law moves slowly. Right? And if I don't have anyone to testify against anyone, that case is going unresolved, but still it needs to be resolved on the street. So they see it as helpful. A third don't really care what the chief believes in. They're here for their career. They want to be saved. They don't care about innovation or partnership. And a third can't stand us. A third thing that we coddle criminals, that we are drainage of money, that we provide, we muddle the moral water, that really what criminals need is punishment. And you won't convince them. And I'm okay with that. We as civilians actually do not have a good understanding of what police is. Right? I call street workers and police, we're the garbage cleaners of society. We are sent to people's worst, cops particularly, more than street workers. Imagine that all your life you're responding to people's worst decision. How optimistic is it going to make you about a human being? All right? So in the morning you go to a child molestation case. An hour later is a woman cutting her throat, a mother, because she couldn't. Listen, I'm really using cases from Providence, but it's everywhere. A woman was just cut her throat because she feels depressed and things are not working for her. She's in a cheap, broken down Corolla, and she thinks it's over. And then you have a shooting after school at 3 o'clock and a kid's brain on the pavement. So you're going home to your family. How optimistic are you feeling about human nature and human beings? And how do you just hug your kid and your wife, or if you're a female officer, your husband, or whoever it is in your partnership, right? That's why I always said there's very different, firefighters and cops are very different fields. And alcoholism and divorce rates are very high among cops. So one of the things, if we're going to build the beloved community, and I'm using those high words that we use, and don't be shy of using high goals. We're very practical, but the goals got to be big ones. The police is part of us. So while I'm a big believer in reforms in police and worked with some of the best chiefs in the country on doing it, it's got to come both ways. Each side got to meet the other. We got to recognize, you had yesterday police officers shot in this city, right? And we got to recognize that an officer, I always said, actually it's safer to be an Israeli soldier than it is to be a police officer. Why? When you go to battle, your adrenaline, everything is pumping and ready. When you're back, the most relaxing times in my life were on military bases. It's so calm, it's in nature, it's not part of a city, you don't have demands of a job, nothing else. As an officer, 1 minute you're hugging a baby, the next moment things turn completely chaotic. That creates for a very unpredictable environment. And those nerves, as human beings, as all of us are, think of the effects. So we got to recognize as civilians that part. Another part that American civilians are not being taught by police is actually how sophisticated executive in policing today are. Not only are they, well, we still think of them that, all right, they just manage cops. No, they manage economic development, nightclub management, ethics, law, training, paramilitary, on and on and on and on. When you're an executive today in policing, you have a really complex environment. You manage race relations, you manage the business community, the universities, etc. At the same time, there is a gap with how Africa, particularly African American, but also poor communities, feel they're being treated by law enforcement. We should not be putting it under the carpet. So I recommend that you do read David Kennedy's writing something, and Tracy Mears, she's a professor at Yale. We look at police legitimacy. Chicago is now doing some trainings in their academy by their own officers based on this. And we don't need to accept this relationship. It's bad for police officers. It's stressing them out when they stop a car and the person says, you stopped me because I'm black, even when it's not true. It's not good for either side. And very often we as civilians, we have either taken one side or the other. And our society is very divided. I get stopped all the time. Tenny, I can't believe these people burned their own city, Ferguson. I was like, well, we had people in Ferguson. We had guests from Ferguson spend 10 days at the Institute. I work with a very big faith-based organizing project, PICO in the country, is Pastor McBride and others. 99.9% in Ferguson of the people were very nonviolent and trained in nonviolence. We also need to look at how the media describes it, how they do things. I work a lot with the media. I had some training in media. If there is no, I remember it, we were in a hill in occupied West Bank. Palestinians, Israelis, the army were all day juggling, discussing everything. The moment a rock was thrown and injured an officer, the cameras got turned on. Why? Was this reality or what happened before a reality? Are actually the media now generating a certain way of conflict, because I know if I'm not escalating the protest, I'm not getting coverage. It's too boring for the rest of us who are comfortably living. We got to think about all those things that drive what eventually becomes a clash between poor communities and law enforcement. And I'm a big believer, if something dragged me to this field, is the idea of bystanders. So the Holocaust, where my grandmother perished in Europe, you had the hunters, the Nazis, and you had the Jews. You had other groups too, right? Both were small minority. But what allowed it to happen is the majority of bystanders. And there were bystanders who refused to be bystanders and they hid Jews and saved them. I feel the same with American violence. It is 0.5% of a population in average city that drives 50 to 75% of the violence. But we engage in a debate between two elites, Fox News, MSNBC, again, I'm generalizing terribly. What are the causes of violence? My liberal camp says it's poverty, it's the environment. The conservative camp says it's choices, it's personal choices, and it's parents. Both are right. The truth is both. Environments matter a lot. So, the work, how do we do that? Myself, the head of our victim services, so that's another thing. A few years ago, we inherited victim services. We respond 200 times a year to the hospital. We have the 5th busiest emergency room in the United States. Because of healthcare reform, not just Obamacare, but before that, because of the expense, etc., most cities around southern Massachusetts and eastern Connecticut now send their shooting victims into Rhode Island, into $1.5 billion lifespan health system. So our trauma room is a very busy one. It has 400 people. At any moment, I don't know, we have like 30, 40 operating rooms. So it's 24-hour a day operation. We respond to every shooting and stabbing. A very small staff of street workers and then followed by victim services. We deal with any homicide in Rhode Island. It could be a very prominent doctor killed by his gay lover. He becomes our client. Nothing to do with gangs. Doesn't matter where it happens in Rhode Island. It could be a student from Philadelphia who was killed at a nightclub in Providence. We serve them for the whole state of Rhode Island. So that's the other part. Then we have a very basic reentry program. It's weak, it's small. But again, we only look for gun and gang related, young people, up to 24, young with guns and gang affiliations. So not everyone who comes out. So most of us chances of getting killed is 4 in 100,000. A young black man in a network of conflict, they have 65 times more chance to get killed. It's a very select group. So if someone is in the hospital for a gun shooting, it makes a lot of sense. I call them, you just entered the Platinum Club. It makes tremendous sense to follow up on them. They flag themselves for us. People say, but we don't know who. Yes, you do. You know who was shot. They're the one group you absolutely need to follow and stay close to. There's traumas, there's follow-up to that, etc. So we work with them. We work with every homicide, support the family. The victim services do it. We help with burial, court, anything else, moving the police to really address the family, deal with the family. Brother, sister, how they're doing, counseling. We changed the law, so when you turned 18 as a sibling of homicide, you couldn't get counseling anymore. Our victims, we have once a month a victim support group in English and one in Spanish, and they help us think what laws need to change. In Rhode Island, you had to clean your own crime scene cleanup. You might have to clean the remains of your mother from the carpet. So now we have crime scene cleanup. We have increased the funeral costs, etc. All of that is, I could use some water if anyone has a chance to get to me. All of it is also to build goodwill. All right, so it's two purposes. One is the human right thing to do, but if you're trying to reduce violence, it's building goodwill. You got to build relationship, you got to stay around them. There's a lot of talk in our society about no snitching, but it becomes also an excuse again. It's like the gun, it's a laziness. All right, yeah, it's a difficult challenge. How you overcome that? not just hammering people to talk. One is they have a safety issue, right? The beautiful American justice system allows me to discover and interrogate my accuser. In a dictatorship, you can say that I did something and I will never find who you are. You'll be pretty safe. You will talk. You will also say the wrong things about someone you want to get rid of. But in this society, I'm allowed to find out who accused me of someone. Well, it's a great thing, but it also is a risk factor. Everyone who got arrested with a gun or shot someone is allowed to know who said anything about them. It's a risk factor. So it's not just no snitching, there's a real risk factor there, right? So how you deal with it is we at the Institute are able to move a family immediately into an undisclosed location. Usually it's different hotel deals we got out of the city for safety reasons. We just changed the laws with victims that we actually get some relocation money up to $2,500 for rent, so first month, and a few other things to relocate. Very often we can work and mediate situation. It's a lot slower than the safety of a family is afraid and traumatized. They'll feel they'll have to carry guns. So sometimes relocation is a very quick, temporary fix. Takes you out of the environment. We cannot underestimate the environment, what it produces, right? Again, anecdotally, as an Israeli, I think we Israelis were a lot more violent. We're in the Middle East, it's hot. I think a lot of American kids actually are pretty passive. But it's a learned behavior to be so violent. They're responding to the environment. Finally, we have an employment and GED services, again, for this select group. These GED services, thank you very much. Thank you. In our state, the GED services are clogged by immigrants and all the participants who want to get into the workforce. One thing I learned in Boston, you know the Easy Pass? Does that get all the way to you? It stops in New Jersey. You know, when you're in the highway, Easy Pass, right? When you work with this select group of people, there's 0.5% that have used guns in the city. I want an Easy Pass for them to service it. Now, some people say, Tenny, many people are unemployed now. Why should we help those criminals? 0.5% of the population generates 50 to 75% of your violence. When you have a city that its reputation is the wire, guess what? I'm not coming to start businesses here. So a lot of good people, quote unquote, are not getting hired. But this is the only field. When you deal with cancer and deal with other things, we think solutions. In our field, we think solutions and then we think morality. And it slows us down. If we could for a moment remove morality from what we do and think of solution, right? If we think, as Cure Violence says, that these are people who carry kind of a disease for a moment, people who are involved in violence, let's think how we cure them for the benefit of all of us. Imagine if now we don't look at it morally, but I'm coming out of jail, I've shot 3 people, I'm infected. I'm like Ebola. Are you not, basically if we don't give you skills and GED and job training, you're releasing me back to the community with no treatment and no antibiotic. Is that something you would want? But that's what we're doing to poor communities. In fact, we're unleashing people on our community that are locked up for 23 hours a day. Unfortunately, another sub-skill I've observed, actually and in practice, is torturing my enemy. We torture Palestinians. And when you torture someone, you damage their brains. And when I go and visit someone in high security in Rhode Island, which is right next to the most beautiful mall, which is a paradox that drives me crazy, and I see a young man knocking their head on a glass door for hours, maybe one of them has a towel, I recognize immediately what it is. This is torture. I'm saying to myself, we are unleashing this person in a year or 2 or 3 or 4 back into our community where there's sweet kids playing around and everything, and we're unleashing a terror. And we have produced it. We made a more dangerous person. And we've got to separate, like, are we coddling criminal and helping? I think like a stupid rat. You know, rats don't like to be electrocuted, so you can teach them behaviors. My electricity is the 2 o'clock call in the morning from the hospital. That's what I want to avoid. That's Tenny being electrocuted. It's the 2 o'clock in the morning call, having to dress and my heart racing while I'm flying to the hospital with my team, to see a mother who will fall on the floor when the doctors tell her, because we usually know before, we have to hide it for a while, because we are not allowed to disclose it. We don't want to disclose it, either doctor or the police. And then you never get used to, after 25 years, to a mother falling on the floor and those screams. You just don't get used to that. Right? So that's what I'm trying to avoid. And sometimes our moralisms slow us down from stopping that. Rather than use facts. Someone dangerous, how do we make them less desperate and dangerous? That should be the treatment. I should stop, right? Because of questions?
Yes, I'd like to get some questions. I want to put sort of two things out there for you to respond to. One is, you've been doing this work for a long time. The street work and the conflict mediation, the peace work. Can you sort of give us your best example of some sort of conflict situation that clearly was spinning out of control, headed towards homicide or some other kind of serious violence? And what did you use to prevent that? Give us a sort of walk us through a concrete thing of that nature. Yeah. And then the second thing I'd like for you to talk about is this tension of how do you gain the trust to do that work in those communities with those individuals while also promoting the general, we support law enforcement, obeying laws and that kind of thing. So those are kind of the critical things.
Great, good question. So a few years ago, we had 2 Dominican crews. We're the second or third biggest Dominican city in the United States as well, starting to go at it. Now, these are young people who grew up together. They slept at each other's houses as kids. In middle school, a scrawny little kid, tiny little kid, they turned cigarettes on him, they bullied him. The adults didn't address it. The staff were overstretched. There were no one in the school system built to really look at conflicts. You had a principal, you had teachers, and that school, kids were bullied. And that little immigrant kid was bullied, traumatized pretty badly. One Halloween day, paintball gun, they had a fight, some friends. Someone didn't like how the paintball hit him hard, and there was a fist fight. 2 weeks later, there was a stabbing. Some people went to jail. Eventually, either they acquired the knowledge in jail or not, but suddenly a gun was introduced. What was 2 groups of kids living in the same neighborhood. Pretty much scenario that repeats itself all around the United States. Fast forward 3 years, 5 homicides, including a suicide in Philadelphia. A female detective from Providence came to speak to a kid whose friend was killed. Talks to her. The next morning, she was going to continue the interview, and they found him hanging. Another young man was killed playing Russian roulette among them. So the collateral damage of gang conflict doesn't have to be me shooting at you. It is just being in this behavior and depression and stress that causes more death. We had weekly, 3 times a week shooting. We were averaging between those 2 crews. I couldn't understand. By that time, I was really running the institute. I wasn't really with the street workers anymore. I had a team. I had a pretty good team. I had a pretty large team. We're now a third of the size of what we were. And I couldn't understand. I was frustrated with our team. Why are we not making progress? And what frightened me is the future of the city of Providence is Dominican. It's the biggest group. And what frightened me is you won't be able to separate them. It's not like before we had the East Side against Chad Brown, 2 housing projects, Manton against Hartford, Asian gangs. They were all living in the same neighborhood. So you can't say people are going to run in the restaurant into each other. They're going to run in the laundromat into each other. They're going to run. And I thought this is going to be a 30-year conflict. Now, I've lived that. We had 3 friends, a woman and 2 men, Cape Verdeans in Boston in the 90s, hang one night together. An argument happened. They were really drunk. One friend stabbed his cousin. Fast forward 20 years, 45 dead Cape Verdeans. That's what happens when you don't pay attention. Right? It starts with little things. You got to work on the little things all the time. So 3 years we're into it, and this is like a weekly shooting on the way to school. There was a month where the police and us were racing from school to school. They were using something that's not used anymore, the instant on BlackBerry messaging. We're going to shoot you here, we're going to shoot you. And we were literally racing from school to school at dismissal time. And one Friday night, we get a call, 4 of Congress Street, C Block, got shot. We knew by MOP, members of Pine. Those are these 2 Dominican gangs. We raced to the hospital, and one of the leaders who we know, Sasson, is dead. But the other 3 are shot, seriously. Thank God for great trauma rooms. They bring him back to life. And I made a simple decision. I was slowly evaluating the data on my team and the police, and for 3 years we haven't stopped it. So I said to my secretary, any appointment I have this week, cancel. We camped on a secret 8th floor in the hospital. We camped, we just didn't leave, with C Block. Turns out the leader who was brought back to life was an insanely funny guy. He went to New York when he was young. We went on a summer program before with Rhode Island School of Design, a very famous Risley school. He was a graffiti artist, wanted to do theater. He was so happy to be alive, but he didn't mind us hanging around him and his whole gang, and we were just laughing for hours. We broke the ice on this crew. All right, now then it turns out he grew up with the leader of the rival crew. And as we started then to make inroads towards the other crew, trying to see if we can negotiate someone, we found out why the other crew was so difficult for us. There was a Latino detective who, to keep his exclusivity, said the street workers work for us, and showed our credibility. And that is sometimes the danger. You can have one officer. Doesn't have to be the department was supportive of what we were doing. We have certain relationship. And to me, that kind of a thing, and I come from a society that thinks about intelligence and not compromising people who do certain work. This was a moment that to me cost some lives. There was if you sort of badmouth or gossip about someone and what you do, it doesn't really matter that much. But when you deal with life and death and you compromise someone's reputation, you now cost some life. You now crippled a peacemaking operation. So we made a break. We got the 2 leaders outside of Brown University, the fancy side of town, to sit in a restaurant, talk about their childhood. We started to negotiate a sort of peace agreement. And that scrawny little kid that a cigarette was turned on, the leader got him to come and see me. The problem is he was going to come and see me on Monday. On Friday, that scrawny little kid gets shot in his car with 3 of his colleagues by someone who came out of jail and didn't get the memo that we're in the middle of negotiation. So it was a pretty bad setback. So the hell with Tenny, he ain't going to see me. 3 weeks later, he shoots 2 of his rivals outside of our building on a Friday when they come and pick up a paycheck. This is messy work. And I'll relate it now to the transition on tensions between police and outreach workers. So, as someone who worked a lot with police and is close to a lot of police, it is very fundamental to me that civilians and all of us really think about an officer wanting after their shift to go home safely. It's got to be fundamental. It is, while American police a few years ago, I think the stats was killed 480 civilians, while in Germany it was 8, and in France and England was 0. We've got to put in context also the amount of officers getting killed in this country compared to Germany, England, and France. It is more dangerous to be a police officer here. At the same time, what I ask from our law enforcement colleagues to think, when an outreach worker says that if I look too close to you, my life is at risk. Because I deal with people on the street who have guns and have a code, And I'm paranoid. When people say, well, Tenny, people are suspicious of your outreach work, I was like, well, they better be. If I'm on the street and I'm selling and I'm involved with guns, I better be suspicious of everyone, including my mother. That's the reality. I've seen people who distress create such paranoia. But we got to find a happy mode, and there is no perfect one. Ideally, a police department will understand the risk to our life. Ideally, police departments very often, and police officers are trained and rewarded by information they gather. It is very difficult for the third of the police department in Providence that can't stand us. They complain to their bosses, wait a minute. Tenny and his team gets the daily reports, who got arrested, who was shot, and what are we getting back? It's very counterintuitive for law enforcement to share and not get back. Now, we had a situation where officers went in. It ended up in a gun arrest where we knew actually someone else was there, was about to shoot them with a double-barreled shotgun. On that case, I said to the chief, I did call the chief, because that now involves safety of a police officer. You never go back to that address. This was not a gun arrest actually you did. It's the gun arrest you didn't know about. That's going to blast your officer's head. Don't go there without a SWAT team if you ever go back to that address. That's something, that is a line, again, but it's an individual line. I'm not going to put in compromise my team. But it's something we're not going to broadcast. Right? A certain relationship can be built on trust, but the police department cannot expect that street workers will solve cases. And also there is in policing, and that includes prosecutors and others, there's sort of a mythical idea that we outreach workers know everything. So think about in Providence, now we got 5 outreach workers, at top we had 15. Compare that to 500 officers, 3 shifts, 911 system, informants, prosecutor, jail detective. Who has more information, you think? The police does. Relax. Don't ask me to solve cases. It's not good for our relationship. It puts us at risk. But I had some serious conflict, particularly with prosecutors. They wanted us to hand them a murder. I was like, what we know is hearsay. Again, I don't like, if you have a gun, it can make you lazy with using your mouth. If you think you got street work, it can make you a lazy detective. Oh, they'll give it to me. You got to do your job. There's no shortcuts. Don't rely on us. Rely on us to create peace. Rely on us to stop them. There's a certain moral line. If I think a police officer is going to be shot, I will definitely try and direct the police, hey, if there is shooting where there's not enough resources and we thought the police is thinking I've got to cover 3 neighborhoods, and we can say, hey, have people in that neighborhood, we will call and say, hey, do you have patrols there tonight? Do you have something between your shift change? We have a lot of shooting around shift change. So if there's those adjustments of deployment, as opposed to putting an individual, we will do that. If we can say, hey, you can work smarter using your resources there, yes. But it cannot be that we become part of the informant system. It will kill. And I'm not God, and I'm an outsider. The people that I hire, I have a responsibility for their life like a chief has for their police. And that's very, very, I had 3 people killed on my staff. Right? Not from violence. A drunk driver killed one of them. One, I think it's a suicide, got himself off the rails in a car. Right? And one was an older trainer who committed suicide. So there's a lot of trauma in what we do as well, and we got to respect that. Any questions?
Excuse me. My understanding is that it's incredibly difficult to generate funding around programs that do outreach, and in part because even in the best situation where information is coming from police, even in the best situation where information is flowing from the law enforcement and from your administration, and it's not flowing the other way, how can we do a better way of quantifying the success of outreach workers so that we can generate momentum from them and do a better job?
Everyone heard the question? Measuring basically to prove it so it can get funded. That is, That is a question, like literally, I'm a Red Sox batter and you just gave me a beautiful ball here, right? I love that question. Read chapter 8 of Father Boyle, Tattoos on the Heart. It's titled Success. We're now driven nuts by the research and best practices. Now, we need smart researchers, but their foundations, and I'll be terrible now at the moment, it's another way for us upper classes to analyze and dissect the poor, right? And in conferences around the country talk about that. And there's now fighting different researchers, fighting about what works and doesn't. I just finished some work in another city where I actually saved the two researchers, very prominent people, from embarrassment, because the project was failure on the ground, which an outreach worker can find out pretty quickly. I hung out with cops and with outreach workers and with clients, and it was not effective. Completely different than what the researchers found. And there was documentation in both the police and the program, and we actually had to quiet it down. So we need to bring our field so can be evaluated, but we got to really think hard about success. So let's look at two other fields. Rehabilitation from drugs. On average, I'm told it takes 6 attempts. Domestic violence, I used to say it takes 6 attempts. Then Domestic Advocate says 9 attempts. We just had a trainer of domestic violence, very experienced, who says it's 11 attempts to get out of a domestic violence relationship. Key relationship. A gang is a relationship. It's my group of friends. I don't see it as a gang. There's loyalty. I'm loyal. They're loyal. I cannot, as a judge, say don't associate with gang members. Like, all right, you got 6 new friends from Johns Hopkins to introduce me, Judge, to? It just doesn't work like that. So, my best street worker is in jail now for a domestic. Our best. Committed. Just finished in June a college degree. He's so committed to peace. He was almost killed a year ago. He went to retrieve her daughter from a party. The guys were from another state, thought he came, she said, they're coming to get me, came with his hood-tinted car. He put it in reverse, drove out of there to avoid a conflict. They shot at him and turned his car over. The fire department says, it's amazing that we managed to get you out on time. It's my 4th guy. I'm watching over him on a gurney, almost dead. So that was a trauma. And then he lost one of his clients to a homicide a month ago. He went on Halloween. He left that partner of his, went to live in a basement apartment, was really lonely. He left because she was abusing him. And he lost it on Halloween when he brought his daughter there. So he's now, for a year and a half, our best peacemaker. He's no longer, it's a setback. Are we going to abandon him? Am I coddling now domestic violence behavior? Oh, he apologized the next morning to his daughter. He's taking a lot of classes. He's like, he realized, and my staff also, we have trained ourselves. We often think of linear productive. You get into Europe or youth build, you select people, they do it 10 months. It's a factory model. In what you work on the street, it's not a factory model. It's setback. So we need to look at what's the model, what is success. So we define it 4 ways. And the National Network of Self-Community does the same. First, success for the Institute, that you don't die. Other fields don't do that. I mean, doctors do. I'm saying other nonprofits don't have a first mission, don't die. If we just did that, because you're going to age out of it eventually, hanging with you on that wild coattail, riding with you when you're loving the streets and you're wild, you don't want to get a job. If I can still connect with you and just somehow we can hang together and keep you alive, number 1 is that. Number 2, if we have a bit of a better relationship, don't kill. Now, why is it not together? Because you might still now getting the wisdom of not dying, not taking extra risk, but you still might have a weapon to keep yourself, if I can, protected. It's wrong, but you're less aggressive. That's why they're below that. Third, way below that as a goal, is don't get incarcerated or reincarcerated. We have people who get incarcerated for drugs and nonviolent offenses, that they're like, hey, but at least I didn't shoot someone. It is really, they've then stepped. Now for the system, like telling, hey, one of your guys, your client, you got arrested, see, it's a failure. Like, no. They're very different than when they were 3 months ago, 6 months ago. And fourth, and way below, and we as a field of outreach have very little success with it around the country, we work on it, is having people who are involved in their lifestyle succeeding programs. Programs at the moment, we're trying to retool programs around the country. We, the outreach, are not built for that. They're built for poor people and people who have no skill. They're not built to the hypervigilance, to the nervousness, to the trauma, to the used to not completing thing, to not feeling safe. They're like military people coming back to civilian society. Yes, people are from the neighborhood, but they don't have their experience. They don't have their nervousness. They don't wake up at the same time. They don't smoke the same stuff. It's a different thing. So we have to educate our whole society of rethinking this social, so we're a sub-segment of that. Make sense? And then, yes, we do need to start funding. It's not a cute, gang members are not cute. It's not kids in hospital, but we need to understand that 0.5% of the population is causing, if it's a bullet to the stomach, it's $300,000 uncompensated care for you, the taxpayer. High security in Rhode Island is $200,000 lockup. But we don't invest in these young people. Moralism and all. We as donors want to give to whatever we want. What are we going to give to little charter schools that are sweet? Meanwhile, you have neighborhoods that are terrorized. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed the talk. Can you speak a little bit to how or what kind of work you've done to support the growth of the street worker area? We understand that they work in tremendous conditions, work in trauma, they work in a high-stress environment. What kind of work do you do with them to help them to continue to grow and develop?
I'm sorry, we actually need to get out of this room because another class is coming in. But Louis, are you going to join us for lunch?
Yeah.
Great. Let's tackle that in our lunch discussion. Anybody who would like to join us for lunch and more conversation about this topic will be in E95.
9519.
Say again?
E9519.
Got it?
Thank you.